G'day ladies and gents, welcome back to the War Thunder patch 1.49.1.0 development server. For this video we'll be taking a look at the new ground forces available in this variation of the test server. As always, this is a development server, so everything you see is subject to change. Now, as many of you asked in the comments on my last dev server video, I will only be covering US and Russian tanks in this video, as this first version of the test server only contained US and Russian vehicles. I assume that tanks and aircraft for Germany and aircraft for the remaining two nations will be added in the next dev server update. The second thing to note for this video is I was not able to drive out most of the new machines. As the new additions to the US tree all stacked to form the new US tank destroyer line, I was only able to drive out the first TD, which you see here, and the new premium T28. The Russian tree is a slightly different issue. Some of their new machines seemed unavailable for test drive, and a number of the newer vehicles listed on the dev server patch notes, such as the IS-2 Avenger, were not available for view. I'm assuming that these are rare premiums, only visible to holders of press accounts. So, let's get into it, shall we? So what are we looking at here? Well, this is the 75mm M3 gun motor carriage, and this is the entry-level tank destroyer for the US tree. And yes, it's a half-track. It's actually one of two half-track tank destroyers being added in patch 1.49. However, the US one is in tree. It is the first tank in the tank destroyer line. The Russian version, which we'll have a look at a little bit later, is a premium. Yep, 75mm against low-level tanks works perfectly fine. Projectile velocity does seem awfully low, however. You've got to give it a little bit more elevation than you think you need to in order to be able to strike the target. Pretty short reload time as well. Anyways, let's go through and have a look at the stats of this thing. Okay, so what we're looking at here is an Era 1 battle rating 2.3 tank destroyer armed with a 75mm cannon. Yeah, that's going to be fairly devastating. Now, I didn't actually look at the armor specs or the internals for this one. I have looked at some of the other vehicles, however. I can tell you that this thing is armored in crate paper. My family SUV nearly has more armor than this thing. It will not take a hit at all. Anything will penetrate it. It is also worth noting, and those of you paying close attention to the previous clip would have seen, the gun traverse on this thing is extremely limited, and being a half-track, the front wheels don't give it the ability to pivot on the spot, so positioning this thing to actually be able to hit the target may be a little difficult. Next up, at Era 2, battle rating 3.3, we get the 3-inch gun motor carriage M10, the mighty Wolverine. At just shy of 30 tons with a top speed of around 50 kilometers an hour, this is a fairly mobile machine. For armor thicknesses, however, it's again not much. We're looking at 19mm on the side, we're looking at about 38 on the front top plate. The thickest armor coming in at around 50mm on the lower plate and the mantlet. And this is going to be pretty much the flavour for all US tank destroyers until you hit the end of the line of the T95. US tank destroyers, or US tactics in World War II, demanded that their tank destroyers be highly mobile, not highly armoured, designed for rapid strikes rather than duking it out with heavier tanks like the Tiger. As for the internals, well, as you can see, it's all people and ammo racks and gun breeches inside, with no armour wrapped around it, so you really don't want to take a hit in this tank. There is almost no angle that you can fire at it and not penetrate and hit multiple internal components, if not just take out the ammo rack straight away. It is also worth noting that the main gun is not a 75mm, it's actually the 76mm M7 cannon with 54 shots, as well as a 12.7 backup. Next up, we have the M18 gun motor carriage. Yes, they added a bloody Hellcat, and holy crap, check out the speed on this thing. Era 3 with a battle rating of 4.7, comes in at 17.7 tons with a top speed of 80 kilometers an hour, and you thought dealing with a Locust was a pain in the ass. Armed again with a 76mm gun, the M1 variety with 54 shots and a 12.7 as backup. Being a tank destroyer, it doesn't get access to an artillery strike, however it does have an assorted collection of different ammunition for that main cannon. The standard M62 APC-BC shot comes in with 127mm of penetration at 10 metres out to 89mm of penetration at 2 kilometres. With its highest penetration APCR shell, the M93 shot coming in with 240mm of penetration at 10 metres and 124mm of penetration out to 2 kilometres. So, for its battle rating, a fairly lethal little shell. As for armour coverage, it's got none. 12.7mm over the entire hull with only 8mm on the top deck. Thickest armour on the tank is the mantlet at 25mm. The gun barrel is actually thicker than the armour on this tank. It is not designed to take a hit. You're supposed to use that 80 km an hour get the hell out of the way of the enemy and don't get shot in the first place. If you take a hit, this thing will damn near be penetrated with 50 caliber fire. So, the internal layout. Well, the entire crew compartment is basically stacked full of ammunition, and there is so much of it so close to the other components inside of the tank that I'm not entirely sure actually lowering the amount of ammunition you carry into battle is going to make a huge amount of difference with this thing. Much like the M10, shooting it from just about any angle is going to penetrate and is going to hit multiple internal components with a single shot. Recommend driving this thing, keep it fast, shoot and scoot, do not stop, do not get shot. If you take a hit, you're gonna die. Next up for your viewing pleasure is the 90mm gun motor carriage M36. Now this thing is basically just a Hellcat with more armor added, increasing its weight to 30 tons but dropping its top speed down to 42 kilometers an hour. However, it does have a weapons change. We've stepped up from the 76mm gun now up to the 90mm M3 cannon, 47 shots total. The side armour is still only 19mm thick, although it has been angled out at a 37-degree angle, and it has had an inline taper that is also at 37 degrees. Same with the back again. Most of the additional armour has been added to the front of the tank and the turret. The ammunition box at the back of the turret is now armoured at about 30mm, the mantlet is 76mm, and we're looking at about 31mm across the upper front plate. The upper and lower glacis receive around 50mm of protection, with the direct front of the tank, which is actually an axle cover, coming in at 107, preventing penetrations at that point. As for its internal layout, once again, it's a rolling ammo rack with no armour. Again, I'm not entirely sure reducing the ammunition loads in this tank is going to make a huge amount of difference. This is the way that US tank destroyers are going to be run. Don't get shot in them. Use their speed, get them in and out of an area, never stay to duke it out, because there's no way known you're going to bounce shots. Keep in mind, this is an Era 4 battle rating 5.7 tank destroyer. This thing will go into combat against vehicles like the IS-2. So the stock ammunition for the 90mm gun is the T33 shot. It's an APC-BC shell. You're looking at 189mm of penetration at 10 meters, out to 96mm of penetration at 2 kilometers. With its final shell unlock, the M304 APCR round, coming in with 305mm of penetration at 10 meters, out to 195mm of penetration at 2 kilometers. So this is a fairly lethal little shell here. At 5.7 battle rating, I don't see too many tanks that the M36 is going to have a major issue getting a penetrating shot on. Its biggest issue, as with the previous tanks, is going to be taking a hit itself. And now for the last tank in the new US tank destroyer line, and one that won't have a problem taking a hit itself, the 105mm gun motor carriage T95. Yes, Gaijin has added the bloody Doom Turtle. Okay, first things first, let's jump to the obvious thing. My reaction was probably the same as your first reaction when I saw that this tank was going in at only battle rating 6.7. I thought, Gaijin's back on the bath salts again, I can see a rant video incoming. However, I am not so sure now. Now, there were a couple of things that brought me to the conclusion that this tank is not going to be anywhere near as overpowered as people think it is going to be at 6.7. Now, first things first, we're going to look at the stats. It's 86.2 tons with only a 500 horsepower engine. This gives it a grand top speed of 13 kilometers an hour. With all upgrades, that's it. That's all you get, 13 kilometers an hour. Now, its gun traverse is only 8.5 degrees a second, and it has a very limited traverse. The thing is, I've driven another vehicle, which I'll show you in a minute, that makes me think the hull traverse of this tank is actually going to be less than that. There is pretty much no tank in the game. Absolutely no tank destroyer, no vehicle in the game that the T95 is going to be able to face at 6.7 that isn't going to be able to flank it. What's more is, with its slow speed and absolutely awful traverse, if somebody starts to flanking them, there is going to be absolutely nothing it can do about it. This tank is really only going to have two places that it can fight solo. One will be to sit on a ridge as far away from the enemy team as possible and snipe, where it has as much time as it needs to be able to rotate itself into position and fire shots at incoming targets, or if it drives into an urban area, to bury its ass into an L-shaped corner to cover its rear and then sit there and not move for the entire match. That is its only two options to engage in combat. Anything else, any form of open field combat, it's going to rely on a team of tanks supporting it to prevent it from getting flanked. So, if it gets into one of these two situations, What's it going to be firing at you? Well, the 105mm gun comes with, well, really two shell types that you would consider useful. The stock ammunition is the T32 APBC shell, 217mm of penetration at 10 meters down to 164mm of penetration at 2 kilometers. It's an alright shell for 6.7, however, outside of about 500 meters, you're going to get a lot of bounces, especially against angled tanks. The next shell of the three available is the T29E3 APCR shell. Here you're looking at 311mm of penetration at 10 meters out to 196mm of penetration at 2 kilometers. Great penetration values on this shell overall, but it is an APCR shot, which means you're going to have to accurately hit the internal components of the tank in order to do damage to them. Now, the final round that's available to the T95 is, of course, a high explosive round. I'm not going to bother looking at that too much. As a general rule, 105mm HE rounds at a 6.7 battle rating are non-effective against anything that isn't AAA, so no point in looking at it. So, enough dicking around, let's take a look at this monster's armour, shall we? Now, the first thing I'd like to point out is even the mud flaps on this thing are 25mm thick. So, let's begin with the mantlet. Comes in at 292mm thick with an effective thickness with its slight sloping back of 310, and that is direct head-on, unangled. 300mm seem a little bit thin for you, that's okay. It's worth noting that that mantlet sits over a front plate that is also 305mm thick, giving you an effective thickness unangled in the front of the tank of over 600mm. Now, there is a big hole in the center of this front plate. It is worth remembering, however, that this hole, while it is a weak spot into the gun breech, is covered by that 300mm mantlet to begin with. And if you can hit that weak point without hitting the armour around it, the T95 can hit you as well. You can angle the front plate armour out to about 380mm, but I wouldn't recommend it as it does flatten out these side panels. The side panels themselves are again 305mm thick, and a dead-on hit on the curvature for the front of the tank will only be around 315mm. However, in all other locations on the tank, they are between 410 and in excess of 500mm in thickness due to angling. Pretty much every other location at the front of this tank you can shoot at is pretty much cosmetic. There's nothing from the front that you can do damage to. The few places you might be able to get penetrating shots into, there's nothing behind them to hit. The lower glacis for the T95 is technically a weak point at only 133mm, however it's angled back at 60 degrees, giving it an effective thickness from the front of 285, and it's a tiny little target. That 60 degrees is actually also beyond the auto bounce territory for a lot of shells within the game, so even if you did manage to hit it, it's likely going to be non-effective. The only other place worth shooting at the T95 from the front is the commander's hatches. They're only 76.2mm thick, but they're considered to be over 300mm effective armour due to their rounding and sloping. APCR will be able to penetrate these points, but honestly, best bet is not to engage this tank from the front at all. Attacking from the sides is also problematic. The T95's side armour is actually not all that thick, all things considered, with the side skirts only coming in at 101mm. The thing is here, there is 2 layers of track that will eat everything that goes into them. The angled side plates are also 101mm thick and act like spaced armour to the main hull. They're also angled back at 58 degrees. The main hull itself, as you can see, is only 50mm thick, however, so if you can get through those side skirts and hit the main hull proper with enough penetration, you will go through the sides. It's just bypassing that angling and avoiding having your shots eaten by the tracks. And then we come to the rear, and this is how you kill a T95. Rear armour is only 50mm thick. It is unangled, it is a huge, big plate. There is absolutely nothing behind it that can absorb shots that lead straight into the inside of the tank. With its incredibly low traverse rating and its extremely low speed, getting to the back of this tank will not be an issue either. Keep in mind there are light tanks at Era 1 and Era 2 that have over 50mm of penetration. These tanks can kill a T95. So, flicking through to the internal view of the tank, and as you can see, shooting it through the front would be kind of a waste of time anyway. There's not really a whole lot there. Everything is based towards the rear section of the tank. Engines, drivetrains, fuel tanks, ammunition stores, everything is to the middle or to the back of the machine. Which is great for people trying to flank this thing, as you can see from the angles on it. Once you get within about a 25-degree arc of the back, you can put shots into the ammo racks that go via fuel tanks and radiators and take out the engine while you're at it. One shell and you could cripple the T95. If not, just straight outright kill it. Now for the last US tank we're going to look at today, we're going to look at the Super Heavy Tank T28. Now Gaijin has done a little bit of a wargaming here. The Super Heavy Tank T28 and the Super Heavy Tank T95 are exactly the same machine. They're just two different names from exactly the same tank. The only difference between the two vehicles is the T95 has the outer tracks fitted, the T28 doesn't. Armour-wise, this thing is exactly the same as the T95 I've just shown you. What it lacks is the angled spaced armour plates that covered up the second tracks and the second track layer along with the side skirts. Besides that, armour layout and internal layout is identical. The weapon is identical, the shell availability is identical. There is nothing different about these two machines, and this one is 6.7. Gameplay-wise, it does make a slight difference, however. The T28's lack of an outer track is both a blessing and a curse. First, it means it loses all that spaced armour protection, which means you go straight onto the hull armour as its side defence, which, as I showed you before, is only 50mm thick. The blessing, however, is that without those outer tracks, the actual ground resistance of the vehicle is significantly lower, which makes the T28 slightly more manoeuvrable on the ground. I say it's a blessing until you take a look at this. Now remember, this version of the Super Heavy Tank T95, the T28, is only actually 59 tons, and have a look at this startling manoeuvrability it has on the ground. This should give you a picture of exactly what the T95 is going to move like. If somebody doesn't post a video of a mouse flanking one of these things, I'm going to be very disappointed. Now the second thing I found after spending some time at the range is the 105 on this tank is, well, it's quite underwhelming, to be perfectly honest. The reload time on this thing is measured in weeks. It just takes forever to get a new shell into the breech. Upon hitting a target, I found that even the standard ammunition, which is supposed to be ballistic cap head, reacts more like APCR. It tends to just penetrate without shattering, so if you don't directly hit an internal component, you'll actually find yourself having a lot of issue killing. The APCR round also suffers massive amounts of overpenetration. Unless you find yourself aiming at a thick armor spot, you're going to end up going straight through most of the time. Honestly, I'm not actually expecting these two tanks to be particularly big seal clubbers at battle rating 6.7. I think people are going to find once they've got them into battle they will be amazing in a base defense role, stopping enemy from being able to take your cap, but outside of that, they're going to be rather large research point pinatas. And last but not least, we finish up with a couple of the Russian vehicles. Now, as I said, I found a lot of the Russian vehicles weren't actually available to view, and very few of them were available to drive. First up, we have the 4M Gaz AAA, and this thing, it's actually amazingly well detailed. I love the look of the gun array on the back of this thing. It's basically just a bunch of heavy machine guns strapped together on the back of a pickup. Era 1, battle rating 1, 2,900 RP to unlock. It's an entry-level AAA gun, so nothing overly special here, although I do think it is a really cool looking machine. I am a little curious on why all the trucks in War Thunder always look very beaten up. This is a 1930s truck design at a battle rating where it would be the 1930s. This thing should be brand new. Next up, we have the Su-57, and this is another premium vehicle that has been added to the Russian line. This is their half-track tank destroyer. Era 1, battle rating 2.3, comes with a 57mm M1 cannon with 99 shots. At 6mm of armour all over, with a couple of places that sit up to 12 for a bit of extra defence. This thing is about as heavily armoured as a Honda Civic. As a result of the armour being so thin, looking for weak points is rather irrelevant, but if you do want to shoot one for maximum amusement, I strongly suggest shooting it in the rear. The Russians even went to the effort of pointing the shell heads out the back of the vehicle. I'm pretty sure one HE shell from any tank in the game, regardless of HE shell caliber, should be enough to one-shot this machine. Now, the final machine I was able to get access to on this version of the test server was the T34 STZ. Now, this is an in-tree machine. It is not a premium. It's Era 2, battle rating 3.7. It's basically a T34E, or a Spaced Armour T34. It carries an additional 15mm of armour in plates all over the body and around the turret. This additional spaced armour does make the tank look really nice. I actually like the look of the T-34s with all the spaced armour on them, but it's still just a T-34. Other than that, there's no real difference to the way it performs or what it does. If you're looking for a T-34 at around battle rating 3.7 that could take a few more hits than the ones you've already got available, this will be a tank that you should be interested in unlocking, otherwise it will just be another one for the collection. Anyways, ladies and gents, that concludes my coverage of the patch 1.49.1.0 test server. First iteration of the test server. I'm looking forward to getting on the test server again in the future as the new patch updates add more new machines into the game. I especially want to check out the British Air and see whether or not we did wind up with the Fleet Air Arm. But until then, click like if you do, subscribe if you want to see more. Fly smart, fly safe, and I'll catch you in the skies.